Why? I guess every man in history asks that question once in a while in relation to their loved ones. You see, I know my wife is cheating on me. She just doesn't know that I know. I had a fairly normal upbringing, 2 parents that loved me and an older sister who put up with me. My parents were a big believer in a quality education, so I ended up at a private school. It was a strictly all-male school that believed in football, religion, and education, basically in that order. Next to our school was the private all-girls school, which we had some interaction with. I can't tell you that there is nothing worse than being at a Catholic school when you're not Catholic except for being a middle class or poor boy among snobby rich boys. To say I didn't fit in would be an understatement. I never liked snobs and still don't. I figure everyone is equal and people should be judged on their actions, not their bank balance. Well, that was the wrong attitude at that school, and before long it was pick on the poor boy. I got in endless fights after school, both verbal and physical, often 4 or 5 against 1. I got in quite a few good licks, but generally got my butt beat. Well, I knew it was pointless talking to my folks, as they would just tell me to turn the other cheek and fit in. The school insisted that everyone should be involved in a sporting activity, either through school or outside of it. As the school had a good connection with the police, due to the fact the police chief's son went to the school, I decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and signed up for boxing class, which was run by the police boys club and was okayed by the school. This decision was to change my life for several reasons. Firstly, the rich boys all played football and didn't want to mix with the lower class, so I ended up with kids just like me from all around town. The second and more important reason is that I met my best friend Greg Sands in that gym. Greg was a talented boxer and son of a cop. He had just arrived in town and had signed up for class just for the hell of it. The instructor had no idea that Greg was a regional boxing champ, and being that we were of similar size, he paired us up. The instructor was old school and wanted to assess our talent, so he put us in the ring together. The last thing I remember before the lights went out was a smile and a big red fist coming at me. I woke up to white light and in a room in the back of the gym. I had a sore head and wondered what had happened. The instructor stopped by and said he had assessed my talent and it was going to be a long road. Next minute, Greg Sands stopped by to apologize for knocking me out. He put his hand out, so I shook it, and we were friends from then on. I took him around town, introduced him to my friends and family, and I met his folks as well. The surprise was next week at school when lo and behold, there was Greg in the hallway. I raced up to him with a goofy grin, and he returned it. It turns out that due to the fact his dad was deputy chief, he got a reduced cost education at the school. While we were as thick as thieves, we took many of the same classes together, and we're joined at the hip, as my folks like to say. Sandman, as I came to call him, was like the brother I never had. The bully problem sorted itself out as well. Sandman was giving me extra training, and combined with the twice-weekly class, I was becoming a pretty handy boxer. It all came to a head one afternoon when Douglas Peterson started talking trash about my folks. Now I can take most things, but not when it comes to talking that way about my family. I went nuts and ended up breaking the a-hole's nose and knocked some of his teeth out. Next minute, I saw all his friends coming up the rear. What they didn't see was Sandman. To say it was an epic battle would be a lie. Sandman made short work of most of my foes and I helped, well, sort of. I was busy watching him while I gave Douglas Peterson a few well-timed kicks in his rib area. Sandman was always kind and loving towards his family and friends, but he was just outright vicious to his enemies. Well, we made short work of a few more reinforcements, and we left thinking nothing more of it. I mean, they had done this sort of thing to me many times and I just left it at that. I would then try and plot my revenge, usually with 0 results. I guess it's never a good thing to make rich enemies. Douglas' father was a very powerful man of industry, and he was screaming blue murder. He firstly had myself and Sandman suspended for the remainder of the year. There was only a month left of classes anyway. He then had us charged with assault. What the captain of industry didn't reckon on was witnesses from the girls' school to the fight who totally backed our version of events that Dougie Boy started the whole thing. It also helped that Sandman's dad was deputy chief. Mr. Peterson later tried to make my folks pay for the reconstructive surgery. The assault was overturned, but the suspension remained in force. For the remainder of the month, I had to work at my dad's hardware store to keep me out of trouble. The summer before school started again was a good one. Sandman and I hung out, hit the gym pretty heavy, and took up running together. He hit on my older sister, but to no avail, as she was about to leave for college and didn't want anything to with a high school brat. Life went on pretty much like that for much of the remainder of school. Douglas Peterson vowed revenge, but I knew it wouldn't be physical as he more than met his match, and no one wanted to mess with Sandman. In our last year of school, things were going well. Boxing-wise, Sandman became heavyweight state champion, and I did okay, coming in the top 10 in my division. Sandman actually seriously considered turning pro, but didn't want to end up like his uncle, who ended up broken and bitter from boxing. We were both beginning to date girls from the neighboring school. Now that we had cars, we spent a lot of time cruising around with our dates. I lost my cherry to Susan Bates. It wasn't love, but she gave great head. All in the background, Douglas Peterson was watching me. He had never forgiven me for his humiliation. I never understood him. The a-hole had everything and was even going on to a top-rated college. He had money, looks, and power, but he was never happy unless he was hurting someone. Deep down, he was a coward, and he knew it. Well, his revenge came swiftly in that final year, or so he thinks. He was under the mistaken impression that I was in love with Susan, and so behind my back he wined and dined her. She ended up dumping me, and next minute, he announced at school that Susan was now his girlfriend. It was a match made in heaven, as the Bates and Petersons were the two richest families in town. He had the look of a cat that got the cream every time he saw me that remaining year. Sandman and I laughed about it. I knew I wouldn't be going on to higher education. My family just couldn't afford it, and so decisions had to be made. As usual, Sandman and I discussed it. We actually both decided that the army was the way to go, and so we both enlisted. We ended up missing the prom due to basic training, but it didn't worry either of us. As soon as we got to basic, I knew I wasn't going to be cut out to be in the army for any longer than my sign-up time. Sandman, on the other hand, was born to be in uniform. He loved it. Basic was fine, I just did what I was told, and as usual I had Sandman helping me up if I fell. Finally, at the end of basic, we graduated and returned home for R&R. I had 2 weeks before I had to report for officer training. I was going to be an officer and a gentleman. Sandman had a laugh, and he teased me relentlessly, but I knew I was smart enough and that I would be able to get my business degree. Sandman was going to Special Forces. I never doubted it. When Sandman did anything, he went the whole way. This would be the first time in years that I wouldn't have my good buddy with me. I didn't realize that I wouldn't see Sandman again for many years. Officer training was a breeze. There was a lot of classroom work, but I must say I did enjoy the practical work more. The most exciting thing for me was that once I completed officer training, I would be able to start my business degree. I completed my training and suddenly, I was Second Lieutenant Roger Easton. There were a couple of drawbacks regarding the business degree though. Firstly, I had to give more time to the Army, so add an extra 3 years on top of the 4 years I had initially signed up for, and secondly, I would be based out of the Army History Unit. This meant office work, so I wouldn't get out in the field anytime soon. The office pretty well run itself. I had a fantastic sergeant who basically ran the place and I let him. The sergeant had seen action in Iraq and had been injured in an attack, but he had a real love of the Army and its traditions. Pretty soon this was infectious and I gained a real insight into our Army history and the love of its traditions. I hadn't heard from Sandman for a while. He was over in the shit, as he liked to put it. I worried for him, but I knew he was well trained, and as he said, when your time's up, it's up. This was the first time I felt really stable. I was studying for my degree, had set work hours, and was still boxing when I could. Funny, it felt more like I worked for a bank than the Army. The only thing really missing from my life was a good woman. I was a romantic at heart and had dated a few women and ended up in their bed. While the sex was good, what sex isn't? I didn't have anything in common with them, so it never lasted. This was all soon to change. I had traveled back to my hometown for the weekend of a big music festival. I wanted to see my folks and Sandman's folks and maybe catch up with a few friends, shoot the shit, and have a few brews. Well, on Friday night, I caught up with all the folks and with all the news. My dad was considering selling the hardware store and retiring. He was just holding out for more money. Sandman's folks were good with his dad, in fact, taking over as police chief. They hadn't heard from Sandman as everything was still hush-hush over there. I woke early Saturday morning and went for my run. Getting back, I had a shower and got dressed, coming down to a nice breakfast. Mothers gotta love them. I then went in with Dad and helped him open the store. While in the store, the direction of my life changed. Roger Easton? I turned around and there was Susan Bates standing next to this gorgeous brunette. Susan Bates, how are you? I'm good, Roger, but it's Susan Peterson now. Sweet Lord, I thought Doug actually married her. Susan went on to explain that she was with her cousin and they were in town for the festival. Doug was apparently overseas on a business trip, and so she thought she'd bring her cousin Kelly to her old hometown. Susan then introduced me to Kelly. What a vision. I had to wonder what the hell two beautiful women were doing in a hardware store, but apparently Susan saw me and came in prior to going to their hair appointment next door. I ended up making a promise to meet them at the festival and to catch up. My old man had seen the exchange and had a laugh. He told me to watch myself as Susan was on the prowl. I said to him she was married now. He told me that it didn't stop her coming to town every couple of months and sleeping with every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Good to see a solid marriage, I thought to myself. Too bad. I only had eyes for Kelly. After catching up with a few friends, I went home and cleaned up, had some lunch, and then went forward to my destiny, or should I say the festival. The festival was in full swing by the time I got there, and sure enough I saw Susan and Kelly. Kelly looked pretty uncomfortable as Susan was flirting with every man that came within 2 feet of her. I walked up and said hello. Kelly gave me a beautiful little smile, whilst Susan, obviously intoxicated, gave me a big kiss and then grabbed me. "Looks like he needs something to eat, Roger," Susan giggled. I told her I was fine. We ended up finding a table and I brought myself and the girls some drinks and food. Then for the next unbearable hour, I had to listen to Susan prattle on about her life. Apparently Susan had married Doug straight after graduation as Doug had put a bun in the oven. It sounded like a gunshot wedding to me as the Petersons and Bates were the richest families in town and the scandal would have been enormous. Fortunately for the human race, Susan lost the baby early on. Apparently Doug had joined his father's business, and he was in charge of international business for the company, thus the frequent trips away, but his father was in ill health and Doug would soon be taking over the company for good. Susan was a lady of leisure. Leisure maybe, but she wasn't no lady. Susan must have felt the bad vibes from me as she soon went off with Peter Morrison, the ex-police chief's son, to look at his new car. He was apparently Doug's friend. Well, that's the last we'll see of my bitch cousin. I burst out laughing. Kelly wanted to know what was so funny. I just said she hadn't changed much. I then had the more pleasant task of getting to know Kelly. Kelly was born and raised on an army base and worked as a human resources manager for a large corporation. Well, it didn't take 2 guesses which corporation. Peterson Corporation. Apparently Susan helped her get her foot in the door due to Doug, and therefore, she went to events with Susan as she felt she owed her. We then talked about family, my work, and all the other things that came up. We found we had a lot in common, and we thoroughly enjoyed the time together. We ended up going to dinner, and what was more exciting was the fact that we both lived and worked in the same city. At the end of the night, we exchanged numbers and promised to make a date for the following week. I went to sleep that night a very happy man. Things progressed pretty rapidly from there. We started dating and progressively got closer and closer. Before I knew it, we had been together for almost 2 years. Kelly was old-fashioned, and she wanted to wait until we were married before having sex. Stupidly, I agreed. Believe me, things got very frustrating, but on the plus side, we got to know each other inside and out. Another plus was it didn't stop B-job. The only sour note was the time Susan Peterson would be involved with our lives, and the shadow of Doug always followed. Kelly knew my feelings about Doug and Susan, but for her sake I put up with it. I met Kelly's folks, and although I wasn't socially in their league, they put up with me. I think it helped that I was an officer in the Army and had some common ground with Kelly's father, who was a retired general. I had completed my degree, and I knew the time was right, and so I proposed to Kelly and she accepted. I did the right thing and asked her father, who agreed. However, her mother was none too pleased and said I would be a starter husband. My folks liked Kelly as she was down to earth, and even though she came from money, she didn't flaunt it. Of course, a prenuptial agreement was signed prior to the wedding on her mother's insistence. I had a feeling that somehow Doug Peterson had put this idea in Susan's head, and it had been passed down to her aunt. The wedding went off well. Sadly, Sandman couldn't be there as he was still uncontactable. I got his younger brother to stand in for him as best man. Thankfully, Doug was overseas and didn't come. It was a good day, and even a better night, as Kelly and I found we were as compatible in bed as out. Life went on, and we did all the stuff you'd expect. We bought a nice house in a nice neighborhood. We regularly ravished each other and started to talk about the future. We both wanted kids, but first I had to decide on the Army or a civilian lifestyle. In the end, we decided I should use my degree, and so I started looking around for a new career. I got lucky, and a major bank needed someone to run their internal and external security. The job paid twice what I was making in the Army, so I put in my papers and my Army days were over. We started trying for kids right away, but it just didn't happen. Although I knew I was under greater pressure and worked more hours, I knew there had to be more. I went to the doctor and had myself examined, and a few days later I got the bad news that I was sterile. I didn't know how I was going to tell Kelly she really wanted kids. I thought I'd look into adoption, get the facts, take her on a cruise, and break the bad news to her then. Well, that plan went as shit when I surprised her with the cruise. Kelly responded by saying that she had been promoted and was now reporting directly to the CEO of Peterson Corporation, Mr. Doug Peterson. Doug had asked her as the Human Resources Department head to accompany him on a 2-week tour of their businesses throughout the various states. Some layoffs were going to happen and Kelly was needed. I had a bad feeling about this, but what could I say? Kelly knew my concerns but assured me Doug had completely changed from his high school self and that he was all business. I knew she was wrong the morning she left. The a-hole showed up in a limo with a big grin and a wave to me. Kelly kissed me on the way out and promised she'd call me when she could. With that, the limo drove off. I spent the next few days sulking. Kelly called and said everything was fine and that Doug was all business. The weekend finally came and I was sitting down and having breakfast Saturday morning when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a well-tanned individual standing at the entry. It was Sandman. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Sandman. He looked different, harder, more world-weary, but I guess word is that to people. We gave each other a hug, and he came in. We each had a brew, and when he sat down, he asked me where my better half was. I told him she was on a business trip out of town. I was more interested in how he was. "Good to be back in the world, my friend," was all he had to say first off. He went through his many travels in special forces, and by God, he had seen some heavy shit. He then broke the news that he had left the army. He basically had enough of the killing. He'd miss his fellow brothers, but he was now 28 years old, had done his 10 years and wanted out. I caught him up on my life, told him about Kelly, and also the connection to Doug Peterson. We had a laugh about Susan marrying the prick. By now it was dark, so I cooked us something to eat, and we talked some more. He looked at the wedding photos, and he suddenly had a strange look on his face. Holy shit, that's General Bates. I asked him how he knew him, and he told me he was his commander when he first joined Special Forces. He said he was a tough old bird and they got on quite well at the time. I told him a bit about Kelly's family and asked him if he knew Mrs. Bates. He said not that well with a smirk. I asked him for some more information due to his smirk. Apparently Mrs. Bates knew a lot of the general's officers and staff very well, that is, in the biblical sense. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe the stuck-up old bitch was a common 304. He said that was one of the main reasons the general retired, as he had to get her away from the army base before the scandal erupted. I couldn't believe that the general would remain married to her. It's all about power and money, Rog, and she controls it, and the general wants it. Christ, what kind of family did I marry into? I asked Sandman to stay the night, but he had to leave, and at the last possible moment, he broke the news to me that he was reporting to the police academy Monday morning for training. He was becoming a cop like his old man. He did promise to come over when Kelly came home. I had a lot to think about for starters. How far does an apple fall from the tree? I was already concerned about Doug and Kelly's relationship, and now I learned that her mother was a 304 just like her cousin Susan. The other thing that concerned me is Sandman. He just seemed different. He had changed dramatically in appearance and attitude and didn't seem like himself. Then again, I hadn't seen him for nearly 10 years, so people change. I figured I was being too harsh on the guy. After all, he had just got back and everything was most likely too overwhelming. Anyway, I had more troubles on my mind with Kelly and the revelations about her mother. The next week passed pretty quickly as I was busy at work, and Kelly called a couple of times that week. I was too busy to worry too much about my concerns regarding Doug, and Kelly and I knew she would be back Friday night anyway. Sure enough, around 8 p.m. Friday night, Kelly arrived home in the limo. She gave me a big kiss and a cuddle and said she was so happy to see me. I tried to see if any mannerisms had changed, but she was the same old Kelly. She went up to have a shower, and I took her bags to the laundry. I couldn't help myself, so I looked through her bags, but found nothing of consequence. We had a late dinner and then made love all night. Damn, I loved this woman. We woke up around 10 a.m. and had a late breakfast. I caught Kelly up on Sandman coming back and told her I'd really like her to meet him. I gave him a call and Sandman promised to come over in the afternoon. About 2 p.m. there was a knock on the door and I opened it to find Sandman with flowers and a bottle of good wine. He came in and I was about to make introductions between my bride and my best friend. Oh my God, Greg, you're Sandman. Hi Kelly, good to see you. I thought to myself, what the hell? It turns out that Kelly knew Sandman from the army base when her dad was in charge. So for the next few hours they caught up on all the comings and goings, and I felt like a third wheel. I ended up cooking dinner, and coming back into the living room heard something like, "Does he know? Do I know what?" I asked. They were both caught with a funny look on their face. Sandman got up and stated he had to go, and Kelly and I needed to talk first and we would catch up later. When he left, I asked what was going on. Kelly was a bit embarrassed and said something like it's a small world. It came out that Sandman and Kelly had a relationship on base. The general liked him, so he allowed it to continue, but they broke up after he left for Iraq. Sandman had been my wife's former lover. I couldn't exactly be jealous, I mean this was years ago. What I couldn't understand is why Sandman said nothing after he looked at the wedding photos. Everything became clear in an instant though. He still held a torch for her. That's why he didn't come to the wedding or come home. I asked Kelly if this was going to be a problem. She said no, that she loved me and only me. I was still a little pissed that neither of them said anything, as Kelly had seen pictures of me and Sandman together as well. I ended up calling Sandman, and he gave much the same story and said he didn't want to upset or worry me about past events. I accepted it at face value and told him not to worry about it. Life kept on keeping on. With Kelly now busier than ever in her new role, children went on the back burner, so I didn't bother saying anything about being sterile. Sandman graduated and started life as a cop. He ended up on the drug squad. I was also kept busy with the bank. Things started changing at home, but ever so slowly, at least that's what it seemed like. We went from having sex 3 times a week to once a week. Then it became once every couple of weeks, if at all. This coincided with Kelly working lots of late nights with Doug and going on various overnight business trips. I just knew something wasn't right. I figured if it walks like a duck. I decided I had to get away and do some serious thinking, or was that drinking? Dad had finally decided to retire and had sold his business. This was the opportunity one was looking for. I told Kelly I was going to take a week's vacation and help Dad with the closing of the store. She was all for it and said it would be a good time as she had to work late all week with Doug and some other executives of the company due to a restructure. I arrived at my folks' place around 10 a.m. Monday. I went down to the store and helped Dad all day. We ended up going to the Irish pub and had a few Irish together. I talked about anything but what was worrying me when Dad said something that really blew me out of the water. "Son, I think you should start protecting yourself ASAP." I asked him what he meant. He looked me in the eye. He told me there were fairly vicious rumors going around town that Kelly Easton was just like her cousin Susan Peterson. I asked him specifically what was being said. He broke it to me gently, saying that the main rumor was Doug Peterson was telling everyone that he was screwing Kelly 3 times a week at the office. To say I was angry was an understatement. I felt like David Banner turning into the Hulk. It's one thing to suspect, but another for it to be thrown in your face. It all added up, and I was just too much of a fool to fully realize it. I just thought back to my question a while back. Does an apple fall far from the tree? I would make them all pay for making a fool of me. First things first, I was going to make an unannounced call to Susan Peterson. The Bates estate was the biggest place in town. It was a mansion that everyone called the White House because it was so large. I was headed back to the city to find Susan when I had heard that she was actually at her parents' place. I knew her parents fairly well due to the time I had dated their daughter during high school. Her parents were okay to me, but I knew they hadn't considered me good enough to marry Susan, or anything else for that matter. Susan often told me while we were dating that her parents just wanted her to slum it with me to get it out of her system. I got to the main house, and there was Susan Peterson sitting out on the porch. I climbed out of my car and went over to the porch. "I heard a rumor you were in town. Trouble in paradise?" "I could say the same to you, Susan, and no, I'm just here to help my dad close up his business." Susan didn't look real good. She looked pale and nervous. She offered me a drink, and I accepted. A nice cold beer was just the ticket. Susan asked me what I was doing there. "Susan, I'll get straight to the point. Is Doug screwing my wife?" "Jesus, you don't mess around, Roger." "Yeah, well, it's all around town." Susan started crying. She explained that she had left Doug and was now living back here. The divorce was only a matter of time. Susan explained that they were forced into marriage, and both of them resented the other. Doug began screwing around with other women straight away and didn't hide the fact. In fact, I got a nice tip from Susan that he actually had a swank apartment near his office where he bedded his conquests. Susan, being Susan, then started having affairs to throw in his face. What a mess. Doug had been persisting in the last 2 years for a divorce, but Susan refused on the advice of her mom and aunt. Everything came to a head a week ago when Doug admitted that he was sleeping with Kelly and would be a matter of time before Kelly took her side of the bed over. Enough was enough, and Susan packed up and left. Susan and I talked some more. She shed a few tears for Doug's role in my marriage problems, but I was beyond caring about sympathy from a Peterson or a Bates. Susan vowed to make Doug pay, but again, I wanted to exact my measure of revenge on my terms. I wished Susan well and was hopeful that would be the last time I ever spoke to her or saw her ever again. When I got home, my folks had gone out for dinner, and there was a note saying Kelly needed to talk with me urgently. I thought to myself, screw that, and grabbed a cold beer and sat out on the deck. I switched my mobile phone back on, and sure enough, there were several missed calls and messages. I couldn't deal with any more today, so I switched the phone back off. My folks got home around 10 p.m. By then I was my 9th beer. The phone had been ringing nonstop all night, so I ended up taking it off the hook. Dad ended up having a beer with me, and I then staggered off to bed. Next morning, I woke with a headache and the smell of bacon and eggs cooking. God bless all the mothers of the world. I got up, had a shower, and then sat down with my folks for breakfast. I then headed to the store with Dad to do the final handover with the new owner. We said a sad farewell to the store, and we're back home in time for lunch. After lunch, Dad and I headed out to do some fishing. We had a good talk, and he agreed with me that I should confront this business head-on and be done with it. The fish weren't biting, so we headed home early. When we got home, Kelly's new BMW was sitting in the driveway. I steadied myself and walked in the house with Dad. Kelly was on the lounge with a box of tissues and had been talking with my mom. Mom looked at me and asked Dad to take her to the store, and then they would call around to their friends the Browns for dinner. When my parents left, I asked Kelly if she wanted a drink. She said no. I got up and grabbed a beer from the fridge. As I was coming back, Kelly ran into my arms and started crying. She said she needed to talk to me. Kelly started by saying how Susan had phoned her yesterday and told her about the upcoming divorce and wanted to thank her for making me available again. Kelly asked her what she meant, and Susan told her that Roger knew all about why Doug was calling late meetings. With that, she started calling me straight away, leaving endless messages, of which none were returned. Kelly then took a couple of days off and drove straight here to talk with me. The waterworks started again, but I had hardened myself for the truth. I asked her straight out if she was having an affair with Doug. Kelly swore to me she did not have an affair with Doug, and they were genuinely late meetings with several other executives also in attendance. I then confronted Kelly about the rumors around town that Doug had started. Kelly was prepared for that as well. She said it wasn't Doug, but Susan starting those rumors to break us up. Kelly claimed that Susan still loved me and only broke up with me in high school due to the pressure placed onto her by her parents. Kelly also said she had spoken with Doug and would no longer be attending any late-night meetings. Well, the story sounded good in theory, but I thought it was a bunch of horse shit. Firstly, I'm no expert on women, but I knew Susan did not love me. I was just a cheap thrill during high school. Susan loved money and power, and I offered neither. Secondly, I knew Doug Peterson, and he hated me and would do anything to spite me. Thirdly, the Bates women had a track record as cheats and 304s. No, this was a fantasy story, and I now needed evidence to throw at her. In my mind, Kelly was now the enemy, but I had to play my cards close to the chest and let her believe all was forgiven, and I was no longer suspicious. I gave Kelly a kiss and a hug, and suffice to say the performance I put on, all was soon forgiven. I took Kelly out for dinner that night, and thankfully she was too tired to make love. Next morning she left early, happy and smiling after talking to my folks about Christmas arrangements. I told her I loved her and would see her in a couple of days after we had finalized the arrangements with the store. Dad looked at me funny but was smart enough not to say anything. With Kelly gone, I then placed a call to Sandman. It was time to get him in the game and get his help with surveillance on Kelly. I left a message for Sandman telling him it was urgent we talk. While waiting for my friend to call back, I had a quiet word with Dad and asked him if Kelly called to tell her that I was staying there until Sunday. Knowing Kelly would be at work, I left a message on the answering machine at home, telling her that I would be at my folks' place until Sunday as Dad still needed some further help with the store. With that done, I packed my car up, said goodbye, and headed back to the city. Sandman still hadn't returned my call. No matter, I got back to the city mid-afternoon and checked into a hotel close to the city, but far away enough that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew, or more importantly, anyone Kelly knew. Once I checked in, I went into work to say hello and asked my boss if I could have another week off. He told me no problems. Whilst at the bank, I organized a new bank account in my name only. I then transferred half our joint savings across to my account and ensured all future pay would go to my new account. I felt a bit better as I now had walking around money and also enough for any unexpected costs that would arise. I then went back to the hotel and tried Sandman again, but no luck. I decided to go down to the bar and have a cold beer. I started talking with the bartender when my phone rang. I excused myself and answered it was just my dad checking I got back to the city okay. I went back and continued talking to the bartender and had a few more brews. By 2 p.m., I decided 3 beers was enough and paid my tab and left. I went back to my room, had a shower, changed clothes, and decided to have a late lunch. Just as I left my room, my phone rang again. It was Sandman. Sandman apologized for taking so long, but work came first as he had just made detective. I must say it seemed awful quick to have made detective, but then again he was well trained. I asked Sandman if he was free. He laughed and said he had just finished work, so we decided to meet at a local bar. I got to the bar and found out it was the local cop hangout. We found a booth at the back and ordered a couple of beers. After our beers came, I sat down and explained my concerns to my friend. I told him about Kelly and Doug, the rumors, the trips away, the apartment building, the bullshit story, and Kelly's change in attention towards me. Sandman took it all in his stride, sipped his beer, and then opened his mouth. So left or right? Left or right what? Left or right knee? I'll kneecap him for you. I started laughing and told him I'd rather kneecap his middle leg. We then got down to serious business. First off, I had to play it cool and keep Kelly clueless and continue operating as per normal. Next, we needed evidence or confirmation that she was cheating with Doug. Then we would destroy Mr. Douglas Peterson. Sandman told me to leave it with him and that he knew some people and he would get back to me with the required information. Sandman had to admit he was surprised as he didn't pick Kelly as a cheat, and I responded neither did I, or I wouldn't have married her. We then proceeded to get absolutely hammered and started talking about the old days until the wee hours of the morning. I awoke Friday morning with a huge hangover and an urge to vomit. I had a shower and shave, had breakfast, and after that started to feel somewhat like a human being. I remembered Sandman saying that I should act normally around Kelly and be the same loving husband. Based on that, I canceled my leave for the following week and phoned Kelly to tell her I would be home that night. I was welcomed home with open arms, had a nice dinner, and tried to make love to my wife. She did question why I wanted to wear a protection and then talked me out of it. Kelly told me she was ready for children and that we should start tonight. I said nothing as I knew she wouldn't be getting any children out of my blanks. Life continued on and I was on pins and needles awaiting Sandman to get back to me. It's hard to plan for the future when you don't know if you're doing it alone or not. I got a bit of a scare a couple of weeks later when Kelly phoned me questioning our joint bank account balance. I told her some cock and bull story about lending Dad some money, and when Dad sold the house we would get the money back. She seemed satisfied with that answer. The weeks dragged on to a month, and I was starting to get worried. I left a few messages for Sandman, but he told me to stop worrying and he was onto something. Christmas was fast approaching, and I really wanted this sorted before the end of the year. I got a call early December from Sandman. He told me we had to meet. We ended back at the cop hangout, ironically in the same booth. Sandman was all smiles, which worried me straight off. We ordered a couple of beers, made some small talk, and he passed over an envelope. Open it, Rog, it's good news. I opened the envelope, and there was a private investigation report on Kelly Easton and a rather thicker one on Doug Peterson. The good news was that Kelly was totally in the clear. She had been followed for a month, and it was all in black and white. She went from home to work, lunch with girlfriends, and back home again. It seemed I was the only man in her life apart from our 2-year-old border collie buddy. Doug Peterson was a different story. The gist of the report was that Doug was a real playboy. He was screwing anything that moved. He was ripping off the company as well to support his growing gambling and drug habit. Sandman knew his supplier, and next week Doug Peterson was going to be front-page news for all the wrong reasons when he got busted with cocaine. I couldn't have asked for a better Christmas present. I shouted around for the bar, then headed home to my loving wife. Sandman promised to come over on the weekend. When I got home, Kelly was all over me, and we made raw and passionate love. At the end of our marathon session, she turned to me and said she had a surprise. "Darling, you're going to be a father." What the hell was going on? I looked stunned, but was I really stunned? Kelly took the look on my face as a sign of elation. She had a big smile on her face, and had I been a lesser man, I would have punched her right in the kisser. Rog, this is so unbelievable. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I wanted to pass my 11-week mark first. Kelly then started prattling on about a nursery, baby shower, and maternity leave. By then I had zoned out. There is nothing worse than being played for a fool, except when you realize you are the court jester. The army taught me to be a logical man, and so I figured things out pretty quickly. The only question remained, what was I going to do about it? I felt physically ill being in bed next to Kelly that night. One thing was certain, she was out on her, but as soon as possible. I couldn't believe the bitch was going to pass the baby off as ours. Surely she had to suspect it wasn't mine? I mean, our sex life was practically zero. I tossed and turned for a couple of hours. I started watching Kelly peacefully sleep with a small smile on her face, and it made me want to grab a gun and shoot her. So I got up and went downstairs to my study. I must admit I did look at my gun and considered it, but that was a weak way to go. What did I really know? Going through the years up to now, I came with some definite facts. 1. The baby wasn't mine as I was sterile. 2. My wife was a cheating bitch. 3. Sandman was my worst enemy, and he was screwing my wife. 4. Doug Peterson was an a-hole, but he had been set up by Sandman. It is a hard thing to come to terms with when you realize your whole life is a lie. It feels terrible to be surrounded by enemies. What I couldn't understand is why. I was a loyal and trusting person. Is that a crime? I didn't know what to do, but I had to make some quick decisions. I took Sandman's advice to heart and knew I had to make everyone think I knew nothing, but at the same time sort this out. Physically and tactically, I wasn't in Sandman's class, so the only way to hurt him was to undo what he had done. They say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I had to speak to Doug Peterson. With that decision made, I went back to bed and tried to sleep. I awoke early next morning. Well, I never really got back to sleep, but finally I had a purpose. Kelly was still asleep, so I left her sleeping. I had a quick shower and then left for the day. As soon as I got to work, I made a call to Peterson Corporation and left a message for Doug to call me urgently. By mid-morning, I knew he wouldn't be returning my call. I was now in a predicament. I couldn't take the chance of going to his place of business due to Kelly working there and the chance of being seen going into the CEO's office. I made a hasty decision, and one I hoped would pan out. I have a pretty relaxed schedule being the boss, so I told my underlings I would be out of the office for the rest of the day, and to only contact me if it was a matter of life or death. I went outside and went next door to the Hertz office and grabbed a big SUV rental for the day. I was sipping a coffee in the rental as Doug Peterson came out of his office and jumped into his new BMW Z4 Roadster. I followed discreetly behind, and as luck would have it, he stopped outside an apartment building. Before he had a chance to go inside, I hit the curb in my rental, ran out, and grabbed him. I thought it was a pretty smooth move, but in hindsight, it must have looked like a kidnapping. I floored it, and we left the apartment building behind. I looked at Doug Peterson, and he was as white as a ghost. In fact, I think the poor moron thought I was going to kill him. I would have liked to, but I needed him. "Roger, please don't kill me. I swear I didn't touch Kelly," Doug cried. "Jesus, get a hold of yourself, man. I left you a message and you didn't get back to me. So you kidnapped me. I don't want to die." Doug Peterson then proceeded to blubber like a 5-year-old child who dropped his ice cream. On reflection, I guess, I understood his fear. I mean, we disliked each other immensely. I knew I had to get to a safe place to talk, so I drove out of the city and towards a lake I knew well that would give us the necessary privacy to talk. As soon as I turned down the road, he started his crying and wailing again. I couldn't believe that this guy was a CEO of a large corporation. I finally calmed Doug Peterson down and took him to a picnic bench and tossed him the report that Sandman had compiled. "Read this and then we will talk." For the next 15 minutes, Doug read the report. He made comments like, "This is bullshit," and "No way." Well, what do you think, Doug? It's complete and utter bullshit. This has Susan's vile hands all over it. Well, I figured the report was bullshit. I just wanted Doug to read it to understand he was in deep shit with an enemy coming out of the woodwork for him. "Doug, it wasn't Susan that gave me the report, it was Greg Sands." Doug turned even whiter and proceeded to tell me that he now knew I was going to kill him. Then I gave the slimy moron the biggest surprise of his life when I told him I didn't believe a word of the report except for the fact that he most likely cheated on his wife. I then further stunned him when I told him we were going to help each other out. It seems lies were part of the agenda. There is no doubt that Doug was a weak, spineless toad, but the report gave him too much credit. In all reality, his father was still running the company with Doug taking orders and implementing his father's plans. Doug was just a figurehead. Granted, he was a playboy, but mainly with hookers. Doug couldn't afford a gambling or drug habit, not with Daddy still pulling the strings. I then shocked him to the core when I told him that he had to get out of town right now, or he would be in prison for the rest of his life. I related the fact that Sandman would be planting drugs, and a very public arrest would happen soon. "Why are you helping me, and why is Greg Sands trying to destroy me?" The first part of the question was easy to answer. I told him I needed his father's connections to get a full background done on Sandman, including his current activities. Doug made the call in front of me, arranging for a flight out of the country ASAP. He then called his father and explained the situation. Doug surprised me by handing me the phone. Mr. Peterson Sr. then begrudgingly gave me his assurance that I would have a full report within several days on Mr. Greg Sands. The second part of the question to answer was more difficult. I just shrugged my shoulders and said I couldn't provide any insight as to why Sandman was doing this. I secretly believed this was a twisted way of Sandman thanking me for screwing my wife. I sat with Doug for an hour while we waited for his father's people to collect him. Doug didn't want any more information, he just wanted to quickly get out of the country. Soon enough, a large black SUV turned up and took Doug away. I knew Sandman would be pissed not being able to find and frame Doug as quickly as he would like, but hopefully this bought me the time to figure out what was going on. I drove back to the city and returned the rental. I could now only play it cool and wait for the report to hopefully give me some insight and leverage against Sandman. In the meantime, I had to get away as I couldn't stand the sight of Sandman or Kelly. I went back to work and spoke with my boss. He had been pleading with me to get out to the regional offices to conduct some training. Soon thereafter, I had a ticket for a flight and was off on my whirlwind 2-week regional office adventure. Kelly was upset about the abrupt 2-week absence this caused until I reminded her that I needed to keep my boss happy with our baby on the way, which shut her up. The 2 weeks went by fairly quickly. I had tried numerous times to contact Peterson Sr. regarding the report to no avail. Imagine my surprise on the last day of my tour when a courier delivered a fairly thick package to me. I have to admit Peterson Sr. was good in that he found me easily enough. Finally, I had the report on Greg Sands, and one night to digest it and come up with a plan of action. It took me half the night to read the report on Mr. Greg Sands. Several times I had to put the report down and have a slug of straight whiskey. The report had shaken me to my very core. I might have known my friend Sandman at 18 years of age, but the person at 28 was a sick, twisted animal. The report gave me all the answers I was looking for, and I thanked God that I wasn't the target of his rage. I was sure Peterson Sr. had read this report and must have had a good old-fashioned belly laugh. He must have felt like a kid at Christmas watching the Bates clan and knowing an anvil was about to be dropped on them. My guess is Peterson Sr. wasn't real happy about the scandal that would erupt with the upcoming divorce of Doug and Susan, not to mention his precious baby boy being set up. What hurt me the most, however, apart from my wife's infidelity, was the fact that if I was reading this report correctly, I was just a pawn. Nothing more than collateral damage in a power struggle between two men that started years ago. Having the answers gave me no relief. In fact, I was certain that I would become a target if Sandman figured out that I knew everything. There is no doubt given this report that he would kill me if he got wind of my knowledge. The report detailed everything from his childhood right up to his police career. As a child, Greg Sands was exposed to a high level of violence. I didn't know, but his mom was actually his stepmom. The report outlined that Greg had witnessed his real mother's death at the hands of an intruder. His father had just returned from work as the man was about to shoot Greg, and his father saved the day by killing the man. Details were a little fuzzy from then on. He got into trouble fighting other kids, and eventually his father remarried and continued his police career. To control Greg's rage, his father enrolled him in boxing classes, and he became a champion boxer. His father then took a new job in my hometown. From that period, I knew mostly everything, as at that time we were joined at the hip, as my folks always said. There were no real amazing insights until Greg Sands joined the army. This is the part of the report that everything became clear to me and made me realize I had to get out of the middle of this. I knew all about basic training as we went through that together. The real interesting reading was when Sandman had completed his Special Forces training. The key to this whole tale of woe came down to one man. General Edward Bates was in charge of Sandman's unit, and this is where I had been sold a bunch of lies. Sandman was in charge of his unit and reported directly to Bates. They took an instant dislike to each other. Bates had a win-at-all-cost philosophy, and whilst Sandman had that in him, he believed in being righteous and loved the men under his command. Apparently, Bates and Sandman had some blazing disagreements on everything from tactics, as well as Sandman screwing his daughter Kelly. Initially, Sandman got together with Kelly just to spite Bates. What was interesting was that Kelly looked very similar in build and looks to Sandman's dead mother. The report actually provided photos, and I had to admit there were some similarities, but nothing as remarkable as identical twins or anything. It seems the love affair turned real serious pretty quickly as Sandman was smitten, and so was Kelly. However, things then turned ugly when Sandman proposed to Kelly, but Kelly refused until he asked her father's permission. Well, hell would freeze over before that happened, and as quick as that, Sandman's unit was sent to the Middle East. General Bates initially went over in charge of several operations, albeit organizing operations from a desk in the desert. Sandman and his boys were given every dangerous, crappy operation that Bates could find. Men lost their lives, but Bates persisted, that is, until he went too far. General Bates ordered Sandman's unit into a very dangerous situation, and apparently with outdated, incorrect information. The report seems to suggest he knew that as well. The squad was supposed to be going on R&R, but Bates canceled it and ordered them in. It was a disaster with half the unit cut down, and most of the rest came back with injuries, including Sandman. General Bates was ordered home, where he gave his resignation and retired. Sandman recovered physically, but mentally he had changed. Sandman swore revenge, but by the time he came home, Bates was retired and gone. To add further insult to injury, Kelly broke his heart and refused marriage based on her father's demands. Kelly was quoted as saying she would always love him and no other man, but she had to follow her father's wishes. Sandman went on with his military career, but then heard about my nuptials to Ms. Kelly Bates. With that, Sandman saw his chance for more than a little revenge. Sandman decided to quit the military and become a cop in my city. I was as much of a consideration as gum on the bottom of his shoe. He knew he could woo Kelly, hopefully get her pregnant, and destroy her reputation. I would divorce Kelly, and a scandal would erupt when it was found out she was carrying another man's baby. I remember Sandman saying all the general loved was money and power. So I believe his next port of call would be to take that away. There was no doubt he was plotting with Kelly, but I wasn't sure if she was intentionally withholding sex from me or if Sandman had some sort of power over her. It looked as if after framing Doug, he was then going to go to Peterson Sr. and help him get Doug off the drug charges. In return, he would then employ Peterson Sr.'s power within the town to destroy General Bates and his family. It was an ambitious plan for sure, but I had wrecked it by helping Doug Peterson see the situation and get out of town. I knew for sure I would be a target when Sandman figured out what had happened. I felt the first thing to do was to get Kelly in hiding or out of town. That would hopefully tie up Sandman's attentions at least briefly. Then I had to decide to either ride out the storm or get the hell out of Dodge before it started. I came home to an empty house. I was worried as it was quiet, a little too quiet. I sensed straight away that our dog wasn't around. I did a quick sweep of the house, and everything seemed normal until I went upstairs. As I entered the master bedroom, I saw open cupboards and clothes missing. A quick check of the bathroom confirmed all Kelly's things were gone from there as well. Damn, I missed my dog. I could replace a wife. I went downstairs again and did a more thorough search room by room. The envelope was in the kitchen. I grabbed a beer and figured I better read the note from Kelly. I figured she must have known the jig was up, but I was the one in for a surprise when I read the note. Darling, sorry for not being home. I had to attend an urgent business meeting and will be back on Friday. Buddy is with your parents as they dropped by yesterday to see us. I'll try and call you soon. Love, Kelly. What the hell did these people take me for? I mean, an untrained monkey could have figured out she was with Sandman. To confirm what I already knew, I called the police station and asked for Detective Sands. I was told Detective Sands was on vacation for 2 weeks. Well, that answered that, but was I assuming too much? When I was in the army, I remember being told never to assume, as it makes a butt out of you and me. With that thought, I placed a call to the Peterson residence and asked to speak with Peterson Sr. To my surprise, he actually came to the phone. What do you want, trailer trash? You got the report, didn't you? Yeah, thanks, Peterson, even though it was a week late. He then proceeded to ask me why I was wasting his time. I told him I was trying to track down my wife, Kelly Easton. He laughed and asked me how my marriage was going. After that, he told me she was at an important business meeting with Brett White, the temporary CEO representing Peterson Corporation interests. I thanked him for the information. The old moron couldn't get off the phone without a parting shot. No doubt White is giving her the bedroom tour right about now. So I thought to myself, for once Kelly has told me the truth. The scarier thought was, where had Sandman disappeared to? I would get my answer the very next morning. I woke up knowing I had to get things moving with a lawyer. I was sick of this charade. I was going to divorce Kelly and get on with my life. Let Sandman have the Bates clan. I didn't want any more part of this sick game. I was really a fool that should have walked away earlier and been done with the lot of them. Now there was no time like the present. With everything going on, I had yet to really analyze and finalize my feelings about Kelly. Her actions had destroyed any future we had together. I really had loved her, but it was obvious her heart was only with Sandman. Deep down, I knew I wanted revenge, and for her to hurt for using me. I wanted to hurt Sandman, as well as our friendship had meant everything to me at one time. But I would rather get out with my sanity than continue this dangerous cat and mouse game. I was pulled out of my thoughts by my mobile ringing. It was Kelly. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't have the resolve to hide my contempt for her at the moment. I had a shower, grabbed a coffee, and left for work. I got into work at 8 a.m. and went about my daily duties. At 9 a.m., I made a call to a lawyer and set up an appointment that afternoon. I then cleared out the bank accounts. I wanted all my assets liquid and on me. I settled for a bank check and walking around cash. At 10 a.m., my life changed again. A courier was standing outside my office, and my secretary was signing for a package. I took the package and thought I'd worry about it later, but the writing looked vaguely familiar. My curiosity was piqued, so I opened the package. What was inside made my blood run cold. The package contained a videotape and 2 pieces of folded paper. The first piece of paper said, "I know." The writing was brown, crusty, and looked like it was written in blood. The second piece of paper was from the front page of the Honolulu Star Bulletin. In large bold face it said, "Peterson Corporation CEO found dead." It went on to say Doug Peterson, CEO of Peterson Corporation, was found dead on the beach. Police were treating the case as suspicious and likely foul play. Looking at the enclosed photo, it was more than suspicious. Doug Peterson looked like he had been put through a grinder. I didn't bother looking at the videotape because I knew what was on it. Doug Peterson's confession. It's funny how a mind works at a time of sheer terror. My military training kicked in, and I clearly knew what I needed to do. I got up, ignored my secretary's query, went downstairs, and jumped in my car. I knew 3 things. Firstly, Doug Peterson had confessed everything to Sandman. Secondly, Sandman showed me there was nowhere on earth I could hide from him. Although I had to admit Hawaii was the stupidest place on earth Doug could have gone. And thirdly, Sandman was going to kill me for messing with his plans. I drove straight out of the city and my answer came to me. I had kept in contact with my old sergeant. He had recently retired from the Army History Unit and had a beach house a couple of hours away. I pushed my vehicle to its limits and made it to Sergeant Moses' place in quick time. I didn't want to involve anyone else, but I had no choice. I had to talk to Brian Moses, as he was a man who had connections and could organize a new identity. I had decided it was time for Roger Easton to die, but on my terms. Brian Moses was working when I got there. That is, working on his tan. Brian gave me a wave and I waved back. I couldn't smile because I was hating myself for what I was about to do to Brian and involve him in this huge mess. "Lieutenant, what the hell are you doing in this neck of the woods?" "Hey Brian, I wish I could say to check out the beach, but I desperately need your help." Brian was a great sergeant, but a better friend. He took me to his house and we sat down and talked. I said I needed to disappear and needed a new identity, and I couldn't answer any questions as it wasn't safe. Brian looked at me and nodded his head as he knew I wasn't prone to exaggeration. Brian got up and made a call. He then took me downstairs. Brian had always been a pretty good amateur photographer, and after I changed my look as much as I could, he took some headshots. With that done, we went upstairs and had something to eat. We made some small talk and generally avoided the main topic of conversation. About an hour later, a guy turned up at Brian's door, and as he took the camera, he reminded the guy it was a rush job. Brian put me up for the night, and I tried to relax. So many thoughts were going through my head. I had to admit my mind drifted to Kelly, and I kicked myself, but I was concerned for her safety. I did something I hope I wouldn't regret. I called Kelly, who answered pretty much straight away. Kelly, listen to me. Get your stuff and leave the hotel right now. Don't go home, and don't go to your parents or mine. Kelly laughed. Roger, what the hell are you on about? Are you drunk? No, Kelly, I'm not. Keep away from Sandman and run for your life. Why the hell would I do that? Kelly, I know everything about your past, and I know the baby is Sandman's, and remember, he isn't what he seems or used to be. You've been warned. Roger, wah. I hung up and smashed my phone into pieces. I didn't want a return phone call or any way for me to be tracked by Sandman or Kelly. I was a little worried for my folks, but I didn't think he would go after them. Sandman was after me, Kelly, and the general, and in that order I figured. I had a few drinks with Brian and then went to bed. I awoke early next morning and had breakfast with Brian. Halfway through breakfast, there was a knock at the door, and the same guy from yesterday was standing on the deck. I parted with $10,000, and I now had a new identity. I was now Justin Green. I had a new driver's license, credit cards, social security number, and birth certificate. It was quality work and worth every cent. I left my new identification materials hidden with Brian. He was going to get another vehicle for me, so I left enough money to cover a cheap second-hand vehicle. I would be back for it as soon as I could, but Roger Easton had to die first and soon. 9. I remember years ago while in the military, talking with one of the men under my command who had since passed away. He told me about the small town he had come from. The town was a pretty nice place except for the name and a corrupt and lazy police force. I could never forget the name of the town, it was too funny. It was called Hell. There weren't any major problems in the town. No murders to speak of, with the biggest action on Friday and Saturday nights, which kept the town's police force active, for the bad guys were harassing drunks, often rolling them for their money. I felt the town of Hell was vital for my temporary safe refuge. Funny place, morgues. It is a known fact that they pay their staff peanuts, especially the night shift. The neighboring town to Hell was pretty good size. It had a morgue and was fairly easy to bluff my way in that night. There was only one attendant who looked brain dead and apparently had an obvious liking for drugs. This was perfect for my purpose. I asked to see the John Doe bodies to look for a loved one. When he asked me to sign in, a $100 bill soon put that issue to rest. I was hoping my luck would continue to hold out, and it did. There were a lot of vagrants in these parts, and unfortunately some deaths occurred with no one to claim these people. The morgue had 4 John Doe bodies, and one was perfect for my needs. The dead guy was roughly the same size and shape as me and was maybe 5 years older. He was the one. I spoke with the attendant and thanked him for his time. I told him I was searching for a lost uncle because there was a large inheritance at stake. His family believed he was dead, but since I didn't want any family members following my trail, another $200 ensured he would forget who I was. Then I casually asked him about his job to find out his work hours. I learned that he would be on duty Saturday night. So far, everything was coming up roses. For me, that is. I got into Hell later that evening and booked a room at the local motel for 4 nights. Hell was going to remember who Roger Easton was. I had several very pleasant conversations with the motel staff and asked about the town. I was given more information than I needed, but they would remember me. I went to sleep that night, very happy about how things were progressing. Friday morning, I got up, had a quick shower, then after another pleasant conversation with the motel staff, I headed into town. I decided to have breakfast at the local diner, which was a very busy little place and apparently was adored by the locals. I then proceeded to make myself known to them whilst at breakfast. I met local farmers, businessmen, and even the mayor. I told the mayor I was quite taken with the town and would be staying for a few days to check out the local sites. By the end of breakfast, many in the town knew the name Roger Easton. My next step was to find the perfect spot for my death. I found it pretty easily as I had been warned of it. Just outside of Hell, but still in the town limits, and as noted, deserved its reputation as a notorious black spot. It seems many people had driven off this cliff to their deaths. I said a silent prayer of thanks to the deceased Army private who had come from this town. Still, everything was going very well. My next stop was to drive around town to try and find the mode of transport I would require Saturday night. I had almost given up when I found it outside of the town on a small farm. The farmer had a sign up, "Dirt bike for sale." I went in and had a chat with the farmer. Then I checked the bike out, took it for a test ride, and then settled on a price. I then threw the bike into the back of my truck and covered it up. By then it was late afternoon. I stopped at the diner for a late lunch, and by chance the sheriff was in the diner having a coffee and hitting on the waitress. I introduced myself and had a pleasant conversation with Sheriff Baxter. He looked fat, lazy, and incompetent. The sheriff gladly gave me a tip on one of the local bars. I would avoid drinking there. However, that night I hit one of the local establishments, which was pretty seedy but relatively busy. I had a few drinks and a few laughs with the locals. They seemed to like me, but I guess buying drinks for people does that. This place would be fine for Saturday night. I left the bar and drove back out to the black spot outside of town. I found a safe spot to hide my dirt bike, helmet, and change of clothes. I then drove back to the motel and went asleep. I awoke early Saturday and felt confident that all was in place and the plan was as good as it could be. I had breakfast again at the diner and chatted with the locals. I left the waitress a very large tip and I then jumped in my truck and headed back to the motel. I had to kill a few hours, so I basically lazed around, watched TV, and went over my plans for tonight. I had lunch at one of the restaurants in town, made small talk with the locals, and left another large tip. Early evening came quickly enough, and I drove out to the morgue. All was quiet, so I parked my truck out back and hoped the same attendant was on duty. My opportunity came quickly enough. I knew the guy was now flush with my cash, and he wouldn't be able to help himself. He locked up and drove off. I figured he was going to go out for half an hour or so to score some drugs, booze, or both. I quickly and efficiently picked the lock and I was in the morgue. I found my John Doe body and checked to ensure that no cameras had been installed since I was last here. Nothing had changed, so I took John, relocked the door, and put the body in the truck and left. I arrived at the black spot well after dark and I hid the body next to my bike and supplies. I then ventured back into town. I briefly went to my motel, had a shower, and changed clothes. I left all my stuff and what I was wearing at the motel. I put the key in my pocket and drove to my new favorite bar. It was really full when I arrived, which suited my need. I was welcomed by my fellow drinkers as they recognized the generous, out-of-towner buyer. We talked, we laughed, and we drank. I was buying drinks for everyone. They didn't realize that I probably only had 1.5 beers all night since I discreetly got rid of the rest by leaving a bottle here and there. I started acting drunker and drunker. I was soon buying shots for everyone. Wow. Roger Easton was a great guy. What I didn't reckon on was that the bartender would actually have a conscience and told me maybe I had enough. He wanted my truck keys, and so I would have to walk back to the motel. I thought quickly, slammed $500 on the bar, and slurred, "Drinks for everyone." While I backed away, people rushed to the bar to order their free drinks. I was given slaps on the back with the locals saying, "Thanks, Roger." All of that gave me the perfect opportunity to stagger out of the bar and jump in my truck. To continue the charade, I drove out of the lot, weaving all over the place, and continued to do so until I was out of the sight of the bar. Now I just needed to avoid any cops or any traffic. I shouldn't have worried, as the cops were probably dealing with the guys rolling drunks, or the drunks themselves. Fortunately, traffic was light, as it would be in a small town, plus late at night. I arrived at the black spot pretty quickly. I parked the truck near the cliff and went into the nearby bushes to retrieve the body. My luck needed to remain strong, as I couldn't afford anyone seeing this part. I quickly stripped and changed my clothes, then dressed the body in my old clothes. Then, after placing the body in the driver's seat of my truck, I grabbed 4 bottles of whiskey brought on Friday and poured the contents all over the body in the interior of the truck. With that done, I opened the fuel tank and put a fuel-soaked rag in there. With the truck next to the drop, I started the engine and put it in gear. I lit the rag as it passed by and watched as it rolled over the edge. Walking over to the edge, I watched the truck roll down the cliff face and explode. With that, I jumped on the dirt bike and rode off to my well-earned freedom. Hours later, and early in the morning, I arrived at Brian Moses' beach house. Brian let me in and we sat and talked. Brian had purchased a second-hand beat-up truck for my use. He also had an intriguing offer. His dad had recently passed away and had a cabin a few hours away in a very isolated spot near a town called Last Chance, which he offered to me. I readily agreed. Last Chance seemed an appropriate place to hide out for a while. I grabbed my new identification and a bag of clothes. Before I left, Brian handed me a phone and cautioned its non-use, except to receive messages from him. He said if I ever got a text saying 9/11, I was to leave the cabin immediately. With that, I hugged my comrade, jumped in my truck, and headed to Last Chance. The directions Brian gave me were pretty easy to follow with me arriving at the cabin around lunchtime. The cabin was going to suit my needs, and the isolation was perfect. I unloaded my gear and looked around. I wanted to grow a beard before I went into town and made myself known. Brian had thought ahead and brought enough supplies to last me a month. My only thought now was I had to hope everyone had brought my death lock, stock, and barrel. Now I had to get into shape again. There were some good trails, so I started working out every morning and got back into long-distance running. I wanted to dramatically change the shape of my body because I had really let myself go whilst working at the bank. A week into my stay, I got a brief text message from Brian saying, "Roger Easton is dead. Funeral next week. We'll watch over your family." I felt guilty about the pain I would be putting my family through, but it would ensure their safety. I heard no more from Brian for the remainder of the month. 3 weeks into my first month as Justin Green the First was pretty happy, having lost weight and grown a pretty decent beard. So far, I was happy with the dramatic change to my appearance, but wanted to give the beard another week before venturing into town. I finally decided to have a look at the video Sandman had sent me the previous month. The video was as graphic as I thought it would be. Doug Peterson was tortured and went through a hell I wouldn't wish on anyone. He confessed everything, including my involvement. The killer was dressed in black and masked, but I knew who he was. At the end of the video, he said, "I'm coming to kill you, Roger, and I will destroy you and everything you hold dear. You traitorous son of a bitch." Apart from the graphic images of watching a man getting tortured by Sandman for no reason, I was really pissed off. How dare he threaten me and mine? He was a sick, deluded animal. Now I knew I couldn't remain in hiding forever because I had to end this maniac's slaughter. There was something primal about the way he killed Doug. I didn't know a lot about killing human beings. I never needed to. Sandman was enjoying the killing. I was sure I was looking at a person some people might class as a type of serial killer. What really scared me, though, is that he seemed to have the power to turn his rage on and off like a tap. It was Ted Bundy-like, but he was much more prepared and better trained. I knew it wouldn't be long before his blood got hot again. Soon he would finish off his enemies. What would he do then? Kill dogs and cats? No, he liked the harder quarry, human beings. I was no psychiatrist, but it struck me as if he had an urge to kill, and he would continue killing anyone, anytime when his heart desired. No doubt the remainder of the Easton family would make a good starting point, or a good future target at the very least. I wasn't going to live in constant fear for the rest of my life, worrying about my family's safety. That video motivated me in ways I would never have believed. I decided to get truly serious by training to my absolute maximum. The weight was falling off me. By week 5, I decided to venture into town. I kept a low profile and brought food supplies to last another month. I then wandered into a computer store and brought a laptop with internet access. My final trip that day was to the gun store, where I brought a good semi-auto 7mm rifle and a 9mm SIG P228 and plenty of ammunition for both. The store was also a pawn shop, so an old boxing bag and gloves went into the buy pile. As I was driving back to the cabin, I saw a sign outside a house saying puppies for sale, so I went in. The lady had one border collie puppy left. I missed my old dog and had to admit a companion would help with the lonely days, plus would also be a good early warning system. I soon had a 3-month-old puppy I named Jess, as well as her remaining puppy food. So I loaded both up and hit the road to get back to the cabin before dark. I arrived back at the cabin, set up my purchases, and fed my new dog. After dinner, I jumped on the internet and did a search on Roger Easton. I got a few hits. The first site I went into was a local newspaper and had a headline saying, "Drunken man burns to death near hell." The story went on to relate a visitor named Roger Easton, who was well known to locals, got drunk, drove out of town, lost control of his vehicle, and drove off the cliff to his fiery death. Sheriff Baxter was quoted as saying there was no suspicious circumstances and the matter had been thoroughly investigated. The fire was so fierce that only a charred body remained. Baxter and his police force were as sloppy as I had hoped. The only other articles related to my funeral arrangements, so it seemed as if everything had gone according to plan. I was at least temporarily sure that Sandman had brought it, or he would have been looking for me by now. No doubt he now had his eye fixed on the grand prize of General Bates. While still concerned, I shut the computer down and went to bed, still nagged by the possibility that he knew something was amiss. My so-called life continued like that for the next 6 months. I lived like a recluse with Jess as my only companion. I went to town once a month, with people calling me Grizzly Adams due to my long beard, long hair, and isolation. I continued to train hard and was down to my army weight with, and in fact had put on a lot of muscle thanks to my daily running, boxing, and rock climbing. Also, my skills with a weapon came back through daily target practice as well. Brian even felt it was safe enough to text me once in a while. I only rarely went on the internet as I was usually too tired to bother. For some reason that July day, I decided to check out my old hometown's local paper. The paper held many unexpected surprises, none of them good. The oldest story related to the Easton hardware store burning to the ground under suspicious circumstances. The new owner had kept the name due to the goodwill the store name generated. Sandman had done this for sure, although I didn't know if he thought my dad still owned the place, or if he just wanted to scrub the Easton name out of his line of sight. That had occurred 5 months ago. This proved my earlier concern that he had not forgotten about the remaining members of the Easton family. What was more disturbing was a story exposed on the death of an old moneyed family. The paper related that it was something like the Kennedy curse. The chain of events started with the death of Susan Bates. Apparently, in a drunken stupor, Susan had fallen down the stairs and broke her neck. What made it worse was that on the day of her funeral, her mom and dad, whilst traveling to the funeral with her aunt and uncle, General Bates, had all died when the vehicle they were in lost control and plowed into an oncoming truck. That left Kelly Bates Easton as the sole remaining heiress to the entire Bates fortune. The article went on to say Kelly was quoted as saying she was deeply traumatized as on top of losing her entire family, she had recently lost her husband to suicide. Thankfully, she was quoted as being comforted by her close friend Greg Sands. Suicide. When was suicide ever mentioned in relation to my death? I checked the net and all articles only ever referred to my death as being an unfortunate accident. I found that piece of information interesting, and I now suspected Kelly was more involved in this series of events than I first thought. I would file away that piece of information. The last couple of stories were interesting, with one utterly predictable, while the other slightly disturbing. The first story was a wedding announcement for Greg Sands and Kelly Bates Easton. By now they had been married for a month. The second story was more interesting, and I didn't know if Sandman had been involved or not. Yesterday, Douglas Peterson Sr. had a heart attack and was airlifted out of town to a major city hospital. I knew what I had to do now. I had to stop hiding, and I had to regain control of my life. My first stop would be to see Peterson Sr. at the hospital, and from there a visit to Sandman. I packed quickly and efficiently, taking enough clothes for a couple of days. Grabbed my SIG P228, my dog Jess, and left. I stopped only once to let Jess out to go to the toilet and to gas up the truck. Jess was very nervous in the seat next to me. She was only a puppy, but she could sense my stress about our possible impending doom. We arrived at Brian's beach house mid-afternoon. Brian was actually out on the deck with a beer in his hand, and I took for granted that he would recognize me. He didn't. "Can I help you, buddy?" He obviously hadn't looked at my truck properly. I was about to reply when Jess came bounding up and started jumping all over him. "Whoa there, little doggy. Nice pup you have there, partner." "Thanks, Sarge. Appreciate it." "Holy shit, Lieutenant. A real nice look, Bigfoot." Brian laughed. We gave each other a quick hug, and he invited me for a beer. Brian had an enclosed deck, so we locked the deck up and left Jess playing with a tennis ball. I quickly gave her some water and snacks to occupy her. I had made my decision earlier driving down that I was going to tell Brian everything, plus leave him the file I had compiled on Sandman during the 6 months, including the report Peterson Sr. had obtained. To be honest, I still didn't like my chances in winning a confrontation with him because the only thing I had on my side was the element of surprise. I needed to ensure that if I died, Brian could protect my family and give the information I had gathered to a police agency who would act on it. We sat down, had a beer, and I told Brian everything that had happened from my early days with Sandman, my initial suspicions of my wife's infidelity with Doug Peterson, Kelly's love for Sandman and ultimately cheating me and being pregnant with his baby, his vow to kill me for interfering, how I died, the Bates and Peterson deaths, and finally what I planned to do. The story took a couple of hours, and I showed Brian the reports and newspaper articles I had copied. I asked him to keep them safe until they might be needed. "You know, Lieutenant, that's one hell of a story. Try living it, Sarge. Apart from my parents and sister, you are the only real friend I've ever had." "Lieutenant, I gotta be honest, in Iraq, I mixed with some of these special forces guys. They aren't ones to be messed with, and it sounds as if this guy has gone off the reservation." "I know that, Brian, but I can't let this murdering prick get away with all this. I'll be screwed if I will live in fear for the rest of my life for my and my family's safety." "I understand, Lieutenant, I really do, but you need help, and I'm willing to help." "Thanks, Brian, but you have helped, and you continue to help. You're going to be minding my dog for starters." I laughed. "Lieutenant, this is no laughing matter. He'll kill you." "I know he will try, Brian. I just don't want you actively involved in it. After all, we need someone left standing to protect my family if I die." It took me a while to convince Brian to stay out of the initial confrontation, to which he finally agreed. His main concern was, could I really kill a man? I replied, "If it's kill or be killed, then I think I must, Sarge." I knew Brian was right, though. I was facing a nemesis that had killed for over 10 years, including plotting the deaths of several civilians. On top of that, he was now a well-connected cop with power and money. I was under no illusion. I had little chance of success. I had never contemplated killing a man, but as the old saying goes, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. I had run too long, and now it was time to face the music. I hit the road late at night and headed back to the city where I had worked and lived for so many years. It was late when I arrived, got a room at a cheap hotel, and dumped all my gear. Next, I texted Brian and told him I had made it safely and was going to the hospital to see Peterson Sr. Visiting hours were going to be long over by the time I got to the hospital, but that's how I wanted it. My beard and long hair would obscure my identity, as there would be security cameras in the hospital and didn't want to be recognized. I knew the hospital layout well since I had been there a number of times throughout the years visiting sick relatives and the like. I had called the hospital from the motel when I first arrived, so I knew Peterson Sr. was on the 3rd floor in room 319. I carefully made my way into the hospital and took the stairs. Had a close call with security when I got to the 3rd floor, but ducked into a restroom just in time to avoid the roving patrol. I further lucked out as the nurse's station was unattended, so carefully made my way to room 319. Peterson Sr. was in the hospital bed and was hooked up to monitors, looking very pale. I took a seat next to the bed and was concerned if he could make it. He was in his 70s, and his only family left was an estranged daughter. I must have drifted off to sleep for 15 minutes in the dark room. I awoke when I heard a woman's voice. She must have been speaking to a passing security officer. I quickly went into the small toilet and closed the door. It was a nurse who was checking Peterson Sr.'s vitals. She also woke him for some medication. Peterson Sr. seemed to still be functioning okay, as he thanked the nurse as she left. He wasn't the same man I remembered from my high school days. Physically, he looked like a skeleton. Peterson Sr. had lost a massive amount of weight. As soon as the nurse left, I quietly exited the restroom, and I was the one who was startled. "Come closer. I want to see the face of my killer, Mr. Sands." I slowly walked over and switched on a small light. Peterson Sr. looked startled, as he apparently had no idea who I was. "So Sands farms out his work now. What a gutless moron. Well, get on with it. I haven't got all night." He was still a feisty old moron. I had a new level of respect for Peterson Sr. He had more backbone than his son ever had. "I'm not here to kill you, old man." I know that voice. It's the voice of a dead man. "Easton, it's you, isn't it?" I was then stunned as Peterson Sr. started to weep, but they weren't tears of pain. Upon closer examination, they were tears of joy. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't the reception I had envisaged when I came to room 319. The weeping was short and sweet, so the old man still had pride. Maybe he would pull through after all. "Easton, I'm so glad to see you. I thought you were dead. We all thought you were dead." Someone finally beat the moron. This was truly one for the record books. Peterson Sr. had never liked me for teaching his boy a lesson all those years ago, but I was smart enough to realize that he saw me as a weapon to use against Sandman. We talked long into the early morning. Amazingly, I had found another ally that would assist me if he lived long enough. I left the hospital with 2 important things: a key to a safety deposit box and a load of information. A lot had changed since my death. I had much to think about, but first needed sleep. I got back to the motel, texted Brian, and went to bed. I awoke at 11 a.m., had a shower, put on some fresh clothes, and grabbed something to eat. I was fully functioning by 12:30 p.m. With that done, I placed a call to the hospital and spoke with Peterson Sr. He confirmed that it was cleared with his bank for Justin Green to be given access to safe deposit box 112. Before going to the bank, I ducked into a barbershop and had my head shaved and my beard completely removed. I wasn't hiding anymore. Even with all my hair gone, you would have to look twice to recognize me. I was a lot thinner in the face and my body was muscular and toned. I got to the bank around 2 p.m., showed my identification, and was given the VIP treatment. After inserting the key to box 112, I was then given a private booth and the requested bag to take what I needed. As promised, inside was a large, thick envelope and a good amount of money. I completely cleaned out the box and bagged it. With that finished, I headed back to the motel. Having brought a takeaway dinner, I sat back to think before reading the important report. The discussion with Peterson Sr. was very enlightening. It seems since my death, things went forward very quickly for Greg Sands. As I had gathered from the internet, my death started a whole chain of events. With Doug and me out of the way, the general became the major target. After my phone call to Kelly that night, she ran. That is, she ran straight into the arms of her lover Sandman. Rumor had it she was telling people that I had abandoned her when I died. Sandman and Kelly were overjoyed that I had weakly surrendered my life. With me out of the way, they could finally be together, although Sandman wasn't too happy that he couldn't get his pound of flesh from me. That just left the problem of General Bates. Peterson Sr. had assured me that the report in the safe deposit box would answer all my questions. Peterson Sr. was grieved and in a rage about his son's death, but even with all his money and power, he couldn't get to Sandman. He decided to have Sandman reinvestigated, and Kelly Bates closely looked at as well. She had dropped the Easton name very quickly, and unlike last time, he spared no expense. His plan had been to use me as a weapon against them, but I died. Peterson Sr. was in the middle of organizing some very shady characters to take care of Sandman before he had a genuine heart attack. That was still the plan until I showed up. Then he wanted to help me because I wasn't motivated by money, but revenge or bloodlust as he called it. He believed I could be successful. He had more confidence than I did, but I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth and send it away. I took the key and promised to keep him informed. That left me sitting in front of a very large report, so I started to read it. A lot of the early information was what I had read previously, but this one had a bit more detail to it. It actually made me look very foolish and showed how badly I was conned. Peterson Sr. must have paid a small fortune for this report. Greg Sands and Kelly Bates were instantly attracted to each other when they first saw each other all those years ago. General Bates and Sandman did hate each other, as was earlier reported. What was incorrect in the previous report, however, was the fact that Kelly refused to marry Sandman until he had gained her father's permission. They were in fact going to elope, with Sandman leaving the army to become a cop. Somehow General Bates got wind of the plan and had Sandman's unit shipped to the Middle East. The rest was history, with General Bates giving the unit every crappy operation to hopefully have the terror outfits do what he wanted to do: have Sandman killed. The general found out Kelly was still waiting for Sandman and writing to him, constantly declaring her undying love. General Bates made a very terse call to Kelly, informing her that if she continued to write Sandman, or even continue with this marriage crap, he would have Sandman shipped home in a body bag. Well, Kelly freaked out and did what was probably the most unselfish act of her whole miserable life. She broke up with Sandman, citing she had to obey her father's wishes. Kelly knew her father would do whatever it took to ensure Sandman never became part of the Bates family. Sandman was, of course, literally heartbroken. He sought a ray of hope with his upcoming R&R to use to fly back and woo Kelly back. The general knew what he would do, so he sent all those brave men to their deaths to kill one man, but Sandman survived and was a changed man forever. After that fiasco, the general was sent home, where he resigned his commission. His last act was to ensure Sandman remained in the Middle East. Kelly never forgave her father, and Sandman was mentally gone, causing his primal rage from his mother's death all those years ago to resurface. He took it out on his thought to be enemies. Killing them became his business, and because of his training, business was good. My part was a pawn in the whole scheme. My loving wife was very close to her cousin, and she knew all about me from Sandman. She came to the festival that weekend hoping to meet me and sweep me off my feet. She was very persuasive as that happened, and we ended up married. Looking back, she didn't want it to go long-term, so she began denying me sex for long periods of time. She thought I would get upset enough to dump her, but I didn't. Kelly also firmly believed that Sandman would return to her, as he would be jealous of his old friend Roger and reclaim her. I was simply viewed as a connection to Sandman, which she needed to exploit. When Sandman didn't return, she ended up enduring our marriage in hopes that one day Sandman would come back to visit me, and they could then reconnect. Surprisingly, a lot of the information in the report came from the mouth of Susan Peterson. Kelly must have foolishly told her everything, and it surfaced because Susan was pretty bitter about the way Doug died at the hands of Sandman. This report allowed me to piece together the true progress of all the events. It picks up when Sandman returned to civilian life. He had dealt with his rage and wanted Kelly back and revenge on the general. I knew the rest. Just as Kelly thought, he came back to see me and found Kelly. They found each other and started sleeping together, and she got pregnant. Kelly had left enough hints to make me believe that she was having an affair with Doug Peterson, so that I would either kill him or divorce her. I would then be out of the picture, and they could become man and wife. The plan got ambitious when I came to Sandman for help. He knew he could get rid of me easily one way or the other. So to keep me pacified, Sandman doctored his report on Kelly to me, then told me he would get Doug Peterson on drug charges. After that, Sandman planned go to Peterson Sr. to make him his ally by getting his son off the charges and proceed to use him to destroy General Bates. The plan all went to shit when Kelly told me she was pregnant, as no one knew I was sterile. That proved that Kelly was cheating on me, and I knew it had to be Sandman because the report on Doug was bogus. I decided I wanted some quick revenge for his lies and her cheating. I figured he was just getting Doug set up to force my actions, so I wanted Doug despite Sandman. Of course, at the time, I didn't see how key an element Doug was in Kelly and Sandman's plan to get rid of me. When Doug disappeared, Sandman was furious and went off to find him. He tracked Doug down, tortured him, and found out I was the one who had wrecked his plans on getting the general. He went ballistic and sent the video package, which in hindsight was a stupid thing to do even though it didn't directly identify him. He was using psychological warfare in an effort to tip me over into the same idiotic rage he was in so I would do something stupid that he could take advantage of to get rid of me. Complicating matters, I had unwittingly tipped off Sandman that I had left the city when I foolishly called Kelly to warn her. She in turn told Sandman, and he started breaking doors down to find me. Only my quick thinking and Brian's help saved my life and that of my family. When I drunkenly committed suicide, they were overjoyed and I became a non-issue. So he went on to get the general. It looks as if Kelly and Sandman were informed of people asking questions about them. They deduced that Susan had blabbed. She was dead as soon as she opened her mouth but didn't realize that. She thought she could hide behind her money. They saw the opportunity to get rid of Susan and the general without raising any suspicion. If Kelly's mother, aunt, and uncle had to die, well, so be it. I couldn't figure out who was more cold-blooded between Kelly and Sandman. Susan went for a night out on the town, and when she got home, Sandman was waiting and broke her neck. He, of course, made it look like a drunken falling down the steps accident. With her funeral then planned, it was a matter of simply tampering with the general's car for a long ride down that steep hill to the funeral home, and the Bates were all dead. Kelly was the lone survivor and inherited millions, plus all the political connections. In one swift blow, Sandman had destroyed all his enemies save Peterson Sr. After a short so-called mourning period, they then wed and became Mr. and Mrs. Sands. The only thing that went wrong is that Kelly miscarried and lost the baby. Maybe they thought it could have been mine and did away with it in some way. I have no doubt Sandman's next move was to get rid of Peterson Sr., but his heart attack probably caused a minor celebration as Peterson Sr. could die of natural causes, leaving both these twisted freaks free and in the clear. I reflected on all this and went to bed. I lay there thinking, I could just walk away and be done with it. I then thought of my mom, dad, and sister. Who knows, if he got bored, he might just wipe out the rest of the Easton family as well? No. As my daddy told me, when you've got a diseased dog, the most humane thing to do is to put him down. I awoke the next morning wondering if this was going to be my final day on Earth. I steadied myself and had a shower. I phoned Brian and updated him on the situation. I told him my plan. I was simply going to ambush him at the Bates White House, as they had wasted no time in moving straight, and once Kelly's uncle and aunt were dead, Sandman had taken a leave of absence from the police force, so he would be there. I thanked Brian again for everything he had done for me. He promised to look after my family, including my dogs, if I was unsuccessful. I rested and contemplated for the remainder of the day. Once it was dark, I changed into my black clothes, checked my weapon for the 20th time, and left the motel. As I drove through town, I thought of all the good times I had with Sandman and couldn't believe it had come to this. I parked my vehicle far away from the Bates house and grabbed my gear from the truck, including my weapon. I knew the mansion inside and out thanks to me previously dating Susan in high school. It was a 5-minute run to the mansion and I made it in good time. I set myself up on the outer perimeter of the house and waited. I had some night vision equipment and put it to good use. I saw movement and sure enough, it was Kelly, and it looked like she was going out. I watched as her BMW quickly left the house and made its way towards town. I waited 5 minutes to make sure she hadn't had to come back for anything, and I then quietly made my way towards the house. I peeked through a window and saw Sandman walking through the dining room towards the kitchen. He then returned to the dining room with a glass of wine. I knew the garage was open, so I snuck in. The interconnecting door was open, so I crawled slowly towards the door and peeked around. The kitchen was empty, but I could hear music playing, and so on hands and knees I crawled into the kitchen. I quietly made my way to the end of the kitchen and peeked around the kitchen counter. I was looking into the large dining room, and there was Sandman sitting at the table, his back turned while reading over some papers. I wasn't going to be a hero about this. If I had to shoot him in the back to kill him, so be it. I moved back, mentally braced myself, then everything went slow motion. I raised myself from the floor and aimed the gun where Sandman should have been. Sandman must have sensed something, because as I was raising my weapon, he hit the floor and my first bullet hit an empty space. Sandman returned fire and hit me in the left shoulder, knocking me back. Screw it, hurt. Stupid, I thought to myself. He was a cop, so even if he was on leave, he was carrying a weapon. No doubt Sandman was surprised on two fronts. Firstly, someone trying to kill him in his own house, and secondly, it was a dead man behind the gun. You know, in movies where people have long conversations while they're trying to shoot each other. Well, in real life that doesn't happen. No snappy lines, as you don't want to give your position away. Sandman fired a couple of more shots. I knew I was overmatched, so I got up and made a run for the garage door while firing for cover. Suddenly the lights went out, and I tripped over something hitting the floor. I had just hit the floor when 4 shots went into the door where my head and body should have been. I won't lie. I was really scared because I knew he was coming for me. I was losing blood, getting weaker, and had no idea what to do. I decided to go out blazing. I tried to listen and couldn't hear anything, no footsteps at all. I then made my play. I figured he was crawling towards me, so I foolishly fired all my shots towards where I last thought he was. I made the shots low and heard nothing. I had given my position away and felt I was a dead man. In the next second, the lights came back on, although actually it was a car's lights in the driveway. And then I saw Sandman. He was lying on the floor. I had grazed him across the head, but he was regaining consciousness. I saw a knife on the floor between us. I grabbed it and made my way across to Sandman, only to find he was playing possum. He quickly rose and said, "Never bring a knife to a gunfight, Roger." Suddenly, blood was splattered all over me and Sandman was falling to the floor dead. I fell to my knees and was picked up and dragged outside by Brian Moses. He had come to help in my hour of need. He dragged me into his car and stopped my bleeding, then went back into the house for 5 minutes. Brian returned, and he drove like hell away from the mansion when everything went black. I awoke to the sounds of waves and a border collie licking my face. I was in bed at Brian's house. I was sore, but one of Brian's friends was a retired doctor and had fixed me up. I had been unconscious for days, but I was alive and Sandman was dead. I returned to the cabin with my dog Jess to recuperate. I closely followed the story of the death of Greg Sands. The police investigation concluded that at least 2 armed intruders got the jump on the brave Greg Sands, and he was killed in the ensuing gunfight. There were no suspects and no leads. Brian had returned to the house for that 5 vital minutes to destroy blood evidence, and it worked. Sandman was given a hero's funeral, but dead was dead regardless. I was going to pay a visit to Kelly when I had recovered, but Kelly beat me to the punch. She was a selfish bitch her whole life, so when she took her own life, I wasn't surprised. She had placed Sandman's service pistol in her mouth and pulled the trigger. In her note, she stated she couldn't live without the greatest man she ever knew, Greg Sands. I felt a bit hollow that I couldn't have met her one last time and ended it on my terms, but she always seemed to be one step ahead of me. So now I'm in my car with Jess beside me. We are heading towards Brian's beach house for a family reunion. Roger Easton will remain dead, but Jess doesn't care so long as Justin Green will survive. While driving, I reflected on love, friendship, and cheating, and have learned the past is the past, and it doesn't have to define your future. I will survive. I will survive. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.